I'm Chris Terranova, and this is the Generational Exchange. 4 generations, one conversation. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Generational Exchange. Once again, we have our dynamic panel together. Representing the 30s, we have Rhett Suchu. Good evening, Rhett.
Hello.
Love your new background.
Thank you.
And representing the 40-somethings, we have Jeremy Davidson. Jeremy, any new news from the farm?
Well, the goat's in labor, so I'm hoping for a surprise guest appearance next week.
Hopefully next week and not during the podcast, because we'll be testing my editing skills if something happens in the middle. So we'll soldier through. And then representing the 60s is Mark Russell. Welcome back, Mark.
Hello, everybody.
And as I mentioned, I'm Chris Terranova representing the 50s. All right. So today's episode is about imposter syndrome. I think for all of us, this is something that's very familiar to us. We've all talked about it. We've all experienced it at some point. I'm hopeful by the end of today's episode that our listeners will have learned about the definition of imposter syndrome. What is it? You know, we've all experienced it through our careers. It's how it's impacted us. We're going to talk about some causes, some symptoms, and then finally some key takeaways about how to overcome it. So without further ado, let's start the exchange. All right, so let's start with the definition of what imposter syndrome is. Now, we did some research on this, and according to the National Library of Medicine, which if I'm going to go get a definition, it's at the National Library of Medicine, imposter syndrome is a behavioral health phenomenon described as self-doubt of intellect, skills, or accomplishments among high-achieving individuals. These individuals cannot internalize their success and subsequently experience pervasive feelings of self-doubt, anxiety, depression, and apprehension of being exposed as a fraud in their work, despite verifiable and objective evidence of their successfulness. It was first identified in 1978 by Dr. Suzanne Imes and Pauline Rose Clance, who's also a PhD, as an observation first among successful women and other marginalized groups. So, in general terms, imposter syndrome is even though you are successful, you feel like a fraud. You feel like you don't belong, right? I think we might grapple with a nagging fear of being exposed as insufficient, but not as a complete fraudster like Mike Ross on Suits, which for those of you who are unfamiliar with the premise of the show Suits, Mike Ross pretends to be have a law degree and becomes quite successful despite not having one, right? Unlike the TV show, our fear isn't about becoming caught with a fake degree. It's the worry that we're not actually as competent, confident, or knowledgeable as we appear, even though we've earned our place, right? So before I go any further, any thoughts, any input there before we kind of dive into different types of imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I think that was a good call out there, right? Because imposter syndrome really is that fear of being discovered as a fraud, right? It's not fear of failure. Going through and doing some research for the discussion today, that was a call out that really kind of hit home, right? It's like gosh, what one of the episodes I was listening to referenced it to almost like getting into a nightclub and being afraid the bouncer is going to find out at any minute you're not supposed to be in there and you get kicked out, right? So I thought that was a good distinction you made, right? It's that fear of being discovered versus right, like a fear of failure or a number of other things that are slightly different from that imposter syndrome.
It's a good point,
Yeah,
Jeremy.
for sure.
And I think the other element is sometimes we let our own humbleness sway us from thinking, well, maybe we are not in the right place, but yet you're given those opportunities because you have demonstrated, that competency and the ability to move forward. And again, it goes cross-generational. I've had imposter syndrome in my 20s all the way up through even today. There are still moments where I wonder, okay, how did I get myself in this, from that perspective?
Yeah, Mark,
go ahead, Brett, I'm sorry.
No, I was just Mark. Absolutely. Those were along the lines that I was thinking as well. And I think a big part of this is going to be kind of self-identifying some of your emotions and where the roots are with them, right? Like where is that emotion or feeling coming from? Because most likely, as you're saying, it's not coming from a lack of having the knowledge or the ability to do your role, because it is very unlikely that you've been promoted once or even multiple times without having any of those skills, right? So I think it'll be important to identify some of that.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to go over 5 imposter syndrome types, and not everybody falls into these, perfectly. But I'll be curious after going through these, which one do you guys think you would identify with when you do feel imposter syndrome? So, Dr. Valerie Young has a great book called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. And in that, she identified 5 imposter syndrome types. And again, I think this crosses genders, races, generations. I think what was really neat about this was that it kind of put them into buckets, and I could see myself in a little bit of each of these, but some stuck out more than others for me. So the first type is a perfectionist. It's someone who sets impossible standards and sees anything less, it's a failure, right? Then there's superheroes. They juggle multiple roles excessively, fearing that not being master of all is somehow a failure. Natural geniuses. They believe that their talent should be effortless success. They struggle if they can't learn it immediately. Then there is a soloist, someone who has a fear of asking for help because to them it shows weakness, and therefore then they struggle to collaborate. And then the last one is experts. They feel that they need all the knowledge before they can start anything. And we've talked about this collectively as somebody, I call that analysis paralysis, right? Is where you can't get started until you feel like you know everything. So based on those 5, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. Which ones do you guys think, when you struggle with it, which ones do you identify with? Red, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I mostly fall into, gosh, I want to choose one, but for perfectionalists or experts, I would feel like one of my top kind of strengths actually is my competitiveness, kind of a feature that I really like to look at those who are similar to me. Or, yep, Mark, there you go. See, we can talk about that on another episode, but that competitiveness that I have always tends to lead me towards looking for the person who is doing, or the business that's doing best in the industry, right? And that's my bar, right? It's someone or some company that's been doing it for years, has it down, already has made all the mistakes, and that's where I think I should be, right? And it's, well, you just got here. Like, do you know how much they tripped getting into this? And so I tend to jump that gap. And so if I have imposter syndrome, part of it tends to come from thinking I should already be there when I should be at the top when I just got there, type of thing.
It's interesting to see it laid out like that, right?
Yeah.
Jeremy, how about you?
Oh, sure. I'd say probably, harkening back to early leadership days, it'd be the superhero one. I struggle with saying no appropriately, right? And I've learned over time that that we can say yes, but, right? Yes, but there's going to be a trade-off. Yes, but we need to reprioritize these things, because I think the initially getting a seat at the big boys table, right? The inclination was to say yes to everything, right? Because oh my gosh, these folks we've been looking up to, the leadership team, they want you to do something. Yep, absolutely. And it leads to long nights and long days and potentially burnout. And that's something I work with my team on, because it was something that I was susceptible to, right? Is how do you say no? How do you juggle effectively without letting those balls drop, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Mark, how about you?
Well, so I think these all come in at a variety of different times. Early in my career, it was definitely the soloist. I was so afraid. I wanted to have everything perfect that I wanted to make sure that I could show my competence by doing it on my own. And obviously, we learned from those experiences. And even now, the expert level, no, you don't need to know everything. I'll share a story from Condoleezza Rice later, around how you can't know everything. You can't be a master of all things. So you really have to put your effort and focus and then trust those around you.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think, to your point, I think we've all felt these different things, but for me, Jeremy, like you, I think the superhero really resonates. And in a couple of our previous roles, we felt like the more we took on, the more successful we would be, not thinking that, could we do these well? And then if you didn't do them well, it was like this self-defeating cycle, right? So you really started to feel like you were an imposter. And then I also struggle from the natural genius thing. Not that I'm a natural genius, but I tend to be a very logical thinker. So I can intuit very easily up to a certain point, right? I remember being in high school that I didn't have to study until probably about the 10th grade. And then one, I didn't know how to study because I never had to. And two, I felt like if I just couldn't look at it and automatically know it, somehow I wasn't as smart as everybody else. And that's translated through a lot of things as I've gotten older too. And I have to be careful of that. Even learning how to do the podcast, I've had to slow down and learn how to do some of this stuff and saying, well, I should just know how, right? How hard could this be? You have to slow down. So, kind of going into some of the ways to manage that, I definitely see those couple of things as well.
Absolutely.
All right. So self-doubt is a natural thing, right? We all have self-doubt. Everybody has self-doubt once in a while, but imposter syndrome goes beyond having an occasional wobble where you're not sure, right? It's a persistent feeling of being inadequate despite evidence to the contrary. Imposter syndrome also isn't a one-size-fits-all issue. It can stem from personality traits like perfectionism or anxiety, and that can make us hypercritical of ourselves. Upbringing plays a role in it for sure. If you had overprotective parents or intensive parents or no support from your parents, right? It could also lead to doubts in your own ability. Even now in today's society, social media with its curated feeds, it's comparing everybody's everyday life to the best of reels, and that can chip away that I'm not doing as well as somebody else and make you not feel as confident. Feeling like an outsider can be a trigger as well. Whether it's a competitive environment like academia, a workplace with a lack of diversity, or simply being the only one of your background in a group, imposter syndrome can thrive on feelings of not belonging. So kind of going from there, Mark, take us to that next step. What do you take away from that?
Yeah, so the insightfulness there is that obviously this is all gender neutral, by the way, right? We've referenced the secrets of successful women, but I remember listening to Ginny Rometty, who was the president, CEO, and chairman of the board at IBM, and she actually led IBM through their first transformation of moving from a hardware company to a services company, and she grew IBM Global Services. She led the acquisition of PricewaterhouseCoopers into the Global Services Group back in the early and mid 2000s. And based on her insights and based on being a father of two daughters and having coached and mentored and collaborated with many females, I try and give them the guidance of, you can't wait until you're 90% confident and you have 90% of the skill set. Your male counterparts, and Rometty, shared this. She goes, my male counterparts might have 65%, and they were going after roles, but I was waiting for that 90 to 95%. So I think in a lot of cases, your own imposter syndrome may impede you from saying, am I ready? Am I good enough? To where, hey, I've demonstrated the competencies and the desires to go outside my comfort level. Why not me for this new and exciting role that is being created?
That's a great call out, Mark, and maybe and something to look for folks on your team, right? You reference mentoring, but I think the ability for folks to recognize this in themselves and get a handle on it So I think later on we're going to talk about ways that you can overcome or work with that imposter syndrome to get better. But if you don't recognize that in yourself and recognize that that's maybe a way you're functioning in your professional work environment, it could be career limiting, right? That fear of taking a risk and moving to the next level. It could impact your negotiating skills. It could impact your willingness to apply for the promotion or for the next job that you're more than qualified and ready to do. So I think that's a great call out, right? That little bit of introspection, what's going on here, and why am I afraid to take that next step? I think is a great call out, and it probably intergenerational, right? Like I don't think there's a generational delineator to that.
Right. No, and one other quick point is it's good managers are also going to recognize some of those areas of opportunities for people, right? So I was very fortunate in my last role where I had a team. I had that blend of people that had good experiences with subject matter expertise, and I brought them together so they could learn from each other. How could I learn, subject matter expertise when I've been in corporate training or academics? How can I, as a subject matter expert, learn the finer points of, training people? So again, I think it's incumbent on managers to also look for those opportunities to give people from that perspective.
Brad, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I thought the point about kind of how it may be related to or could be in part because of your upbringing, right? But I think it's also important to identify there that what worked for you at one point won't necessarily work for you at all times, like you're saying, right? When it was you didn't have to study. All right, well, are you having success later in life? Maybe so, maybe not. Why could that be, right? What are the potential elements of that? When you talk about the, perfectionist and kind of being pushed or whatever, I thought it was funny because I remember one of my papers for getting into college was called The Pursuit of Perfection. And it was about this whole idea of, you're always going for perfection, but you'll never reach it. It's like no one's perfect, right? And so it's this whole dichotomy of like trying to be the best version of yourself you can be while also not beating yourself up too much that you never reach it almost, right? Like you're always setting a new goal type of thing. So I thought that was interesting.
never had a study until somebody threw that PMP exam at you, right? Like,
Yeah, no, that was probably the hardest I've ever studied in my life too. Forgive me just a second here. Okay, wanted to make sure somebody is pinging me urgently. I want to make sure everything's okay. All right, that's right. Being recorded live. All right, so let's talk about an imposter roller coaster, right? Imagine this, you've got a new project and you get anxiety. It hits you hard. You either dive headfirst into the research and you stay up all night, or you procrastinate like a champ. You finally scramble to the finish, and then you have this fleeting feeling of a high until someone praises you, right? But there are all different kinds of people who work like this. Over preparers think, I must have gotten lucky this time. Procrastinators think, whew, I dodged a bullet, but I can't keep relying on luck, right? Either way, in both of those situations, self-doubt won, and the cycle restarts with each new challenge, right? There's this fear of being exposed as a fraud that fuels other, I guess, gremlins, if you will, on top of either being overprepared or underprepared, right? There is that feeling of perfectionism. You always crave constant validation, and if you don't get it or you have a mistake, it becomes a nightmare for you. There's also this fear of failure, right? It just whispers failure equals exposed, and it pushes you to overwork. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts about work-life balance, right? And Jeremy, you and I even talked about some of these things without even really identifying them to imposter syndrome, but it did push us harder than we normally would, right? And then there's the denial of skills. You downplay your accomplishments, right? Again, you go back to, I was just lucky. And then finally, there's a fear of success. The more success equals more pressure, which equals more risk of being found out. And this roller coaster just keeps you stuck. You just keep going up and down those hills. So now that we've identified what it is, some of the causes, and some of our gremlins or symptoms, I'm going to turn it over to the panel here to give some perspective on, if you guys have felt imposter syndrome in your careers or your personal life. What did it feel like? How did it impact you? And how did you overcome it? Jeremy, I'm going to start with you.
Well, talk about imposter syndrome, right? I saw the title for this week's podcast, and we're prepping for it. God, I don't want to get onto an imposter syndrome podcast and not be able to speak intelligently about it, right? So I'm listening to different TEDx talks and trying to do my research, and maybe that's a positive outcome of that, right? Is if you don't know something, if you're not an expert in it, you read up, you listen, you learn. But I did come across some gems, right? Came across Phil McKinney, and he's like the Australian version of Elon Musk and Zuckerberg and like all these guys combined. He was like the world entrepreneur, 20 under 20. Fun guy and really a nice listen. If anybody has an opportunity to go look him out, he was actually at TEDx Boulder. You and
oh, really?
You and Mark could have had the opportunity to go see him. But what I really liked was, oh my gosh, and I totally misrepresented his background. I'm sorry. Mike Cannon was the Australian guy. Phil McKinney was formerly at HP. So I apologize. But he had a really funny tagline around the imposter syndrome. He said, every single person on this planet has this unbelievable superpower. We can convince ourselves absolutely anything under the sun is true, even if it's not. And actually reference that 75% of folks experience this imposter syndrome, and it's significantly higher at the higher levels of success, right? The Mike McCann, the Australian, was another good TEDx, and I really liked him because he called out specifically that correlation between success and feeling like an imposter. All of his cohort, entrepreneurial cohort founders, he said he found himself opening up and being transparent and actually sharing that out with folks. And the more he did, the more feedback he got back. Oh my God, I feel the exact same way every single day. And maybe it's like that old cliche, right? The more I know, the more I realize how little I actually know. But his take on that was, you may not be able to get rid of imposter syndrome. It may evolve and change over time, but you can harness it. And I started my little spiel here by saying, I harnessed that. I went out, did some research, listened to some talks, did some reading on the topic. And that's what he found as a universal amongst that group of founders that he was having this conversation with, is that when they didn't feel like they were an expert in something, if they didn't feel like they know, universally, those successful people were going out and they were asking, they were soliciting feedback, they were getting different perspectives, they were researching, they were learning. And that's a really positive takeaway of, maybe a slightly negative connotation of feeling like an imposter. For me, I still remember being a 21-year-old sitting in a school board meeting with the superintendent and associate superintendent and deputy superintendent. And I'm this 20-year-old guy, and I'm trying like crazy to grow my beard out so I looked a little bit older and, felt like I actually belonged there. And fortunately, this wonderful gal, deputy superintendent of accountability, she said, don't worry about it. Your job here is to listen, take notes, and be able to go run with whatever request they have for you, right? But there's still a part of me that goes and sits at a meeting with the CEO, CFO, chief strategy officer, chief revenue officer, and I still feel a little bit like that 20-year-old guy, should I be here? And what I found is, as you're learning, you sit there and you take notes and you got your takeaway items and you're quiet and you're listening and you're learning. And I think it's entirely possible that the loudest person in that room likely feels the highest degree of that imposter syndrome. Um, so, and even today, Chris and I had a conversation earlier today, uh, brainstorming some pie in the sky ideas. And he looks at me, he says, "Yeah, do we have the expertise or the clout to be able to do X, Y, and Z?" And I said, "Well, yeah, we've been hiring people and having these conversations for what, 10, 15 years now. Yeah, we've got that."
Right.
So it still comes up on a daily basis, but absolutely love it. And a big apology to Phil McKinney and Mike Cannon for getting the two gentlemen mixed around there at the beginning. But um, Red, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, tough to follow that one up, Jerry, regardless of which order you did them in. But to kind of, Chris, I was looking at your question, what did it feel like? How did it impact you? And how did you kind of overcome it, right? Speaking from kind of my roles and how I've handled a lot of this, I think there's always a bit of nervousness or discomfort that goes along with a new role, right? And that's and possibly even with the things that you've done for a long time, right? If it's a different industry or, you're going in and you're taking over a new team, there's always a concern over, hey, are these 10 to 100 team members? Like, what are they going to be like? I've had great team members in the past. I've had some that have been detrimental to the team effect, right? There's always an element here, I think, of it's not all just if you do well, the whole thing goes well, right? There are other elements to it. There are other team members that help you be successful. And so Jeremy kind of mentioned this, right? But one thing that I have been working on becoming more comfortable with, right? But accept that you don't have all the answers going into these certain situations, right? Understand that there's going to be a bit of learning that takes place and be excited for that and ready for that, right? There are different people who can teach you a lot of different things in these roles. Your supervisor at the time will be able to advise you on some things, but how do you do that without giving the impression that you don't know what you're doing, right? I think that's the fear that everyone has, is how do you bring these conversations up without essentially saying, so how do I do my job? And they're like, that's why I hired you. I thought you knew how to do your job, right? And so what I always go back to is, accept that you won't always have all the answers. Now, you likely have a lot of them, and maybe just don't think that you do, because you got this role for a reason. You beat out hundreds, if not thousands of other people for it, right? So you do have some of these answers, have a little bit of confidence there. But it can still be overwhelming at times. So another thing I go back to is control the controllable, right? At times you feel like you're underwater. It just, hey, everything's going awry. I don't know why. It must all be related to me. Write it down or type it out and say, what am I actually controlling here? What can I control? What are exterior factors that are impacting the team that I can't control, that I need to just drop that baggage because I'm not going to be able to take care of it? One thing that came up in one of my previous roles was being able to share the weight at all, right? If you have other fellow managers that are maybe in different regions that are taking care of teams, right? What are the struggles that you're going through that they might be going through, and or that they have a solution for? And part of that, you'll get to share the weight a little bit, right? And then finally, to one of our previous episodes, one of the big things I always do is talk to my mentor, right? It's part of why they're there. It's to bring up, hey, am I as good as I think I am? They're like, well, I wouldn't be mentoring you if you weren't. I'm like, oh, okay. That's another angle. I can take that. And they're like, well, what are you really struggling with, right? Where's it coming from? So
you brought up some good points, and you even harkened back to some of those things that we were mentioning earlier. Some of the share the weight thing in particular, to me, reminds me of that soloist, right? That I got to do it all myself, otherwise I'm weak, right? So I struggle, and being able to do that, to your point, right? But it's easy. It's easy to see how you can slide into those categories. Mark, what are your thoughts?
Well, and I think Rhett hit a key point for me: the controllable, right? What can you gain mastery over? What do you have to let go of, from those things? But even, listening to other people speak, and throughout my career, it was all the above, right? It was how can I reframe something And instead of looking at it as I don't know, what is it that I do know? Guy Raz, who's a former NPR host, and now he has his own show and everything. He talked about being 26 and being a war correspondent, an overseas correspondent. And he said, I just had to outwork everyone. I had to outwork, even myself to prove that I belonged there from that perspective. And then there's a great CEO of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia by name of Madeline Bell. And she shared on a recent podcast is that you own it. You have to own it, because from that, you can set up your own then path, right? You could set up your 1, 3, and 5 year goals, and you know where you're strong. Remind yourself where you're strong. If you have gaps, talk to your internal board of directors. Say, hey, I have a gap here. So what are your thoughts on how I can, overcome that? But always come with the solution, from that. And I think a lot of it is just figuring that, learning and experience is a journey. It's not a sprint. It's nothing that happens overnight. And as soon as you get comfortable about something, guess what? It's going to come back and make you very uncomfortable, because you don't know everything that we need to know all the time.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I can speak to it. We've talked on a previous episode that a couple of us are dipping our toes back into a new career. I'm looking for a new role. And every time you get a rejection letter, whether it's because it's in another state or your skills didn't match, it's easy for me to start going, well, see, I was over my skis. I shouldn't have done that, right? And having to relearn those voices has been very important to say, you just got to keep going. That just wasn't the right fit, right? So it's even just readdressing some of those things, and all of those things that you're saying is working smarter, working harder. You've got to involve other people. Jeremy, you mentioned that earlier. Rhett, you did as well. But it's easy to let that creep in, and you got to be aware of it and pay attention to it, right? All right, so we've all worked with multi-generational groups in the past. From a management perspective, how do you guys handle that when you're dealing with a group and knowing there could be different generations within the group? How do you address imposter syndrome if you're aware of it or you see it coming up? Jeremy, I'll start with you.
I think one of the most fun things about being in a leadership position is the ability to work one-on-one and have that coaching with your team. And I think imposter syndrome is one of those things that you can pretty safely assume that every single person on every one of your teams is going to experience, is experiencing, or has experienced imposter syndrome, right? I think it's a safe assumption. What was that quote, that stat I heard earlier? 75% of folks experience that. I think, the other 25% must be politicians, right? They just don't know enough to. Yeah, they don't know enough to know what they don't know. But everybody else, all of the normal folks. So, for me, I try to take the approach of being super transparent, super candid, and actually having those conversations with folks. And I think a lot of it is feedback, making sure folks on your team feel built up and supported when they have wins and successes, that you're shouting those from the rooftop, whether they're in the room or not. Because that filters back down, right? I might have said something to you about Rhett, and then you'd send a note to Rhett, hey, I heard you did this, right? Like the reinforcement that it's a job well done, you're the right person, we're glad to have you here, and unfortunately that's not commonplace for everybody on every team, and that's kind of sad. Because I think 99% of folks that you're ever going to have the opportunity to work with really are trying to do their very best work, right? They might be off base, they might be going down a rabbit hole, they might be they might be experiencing personal issues, there might be a million things going on, but at the end of the day, they're efforting in the right direction. But those are some of the things I'm on the lookout for, because those, if you figure people are experiencing that, we can watch for folks that are spending long hours, or that are procrastinating projects, or they're not delivering on time because they're shooting for that perfection, right? The soloist. I think we can be we can be on the watch for that and have a candid one-on-one conversation that says, hey, you are good enough. Let's see what you've got. Run it through with me. Maybe you adjust your leadership style rather than having something due on Friday when you need it. You move it up for that person and say, hey, let's talk. Let's sit down and review it on Wednesday morning. So we've got some time to spitball it. You can make concessions as a manager, understanding that not everybody deals with things the same way. Folks tackle things. They've got fears and concerns, and this imposter syndrome thing is one of those things where when you got it, you feel like you're the only person in the world that's got it. Everybody else must know exactly what they're doing. They must have their shit together, right? Like this is just me. I must be the only because nobody talks about it, right? I mean, how many times have you guys ever had the conversation in a professional setting? Maybe you're lucky enough that you've got a boss with a relationship like Chris and I did, or Rhett and I did, or where you can say, hey man, I'm just out of my element, I'm out of my water. How do we buckle down and get through this? But I don't think everybody has that opportunity. So you're siloed, you're feeling like you're on an island, and I think the very best support structure you can have for that is your leader. So if we've got folks in leadership positions that are listening to this, and you're not doing that with your team, you're the lifeboat for folks that are feeling this imposter syndrome on your team. So.
Right. No, and I think you bring up a good point too about calling out, reviewing the failures too, and looking at that and learning from all those things too. I think that's important as well. Great points, really great points. Rhett, what about you?
Yeah, I think this is particularly an interesting question for me because I've been in a few roles now where I'm dealing with different generations that have maybe been doing a role or a similar role a lot longer than me time-wise, but maybe haven't had the impact or the results that maybe got them a position. And so a lot of times what I end up tackling first, right, is this idea of imposter syndrome and such from, what are the challenges that we're facing as a team, right? And how do I kind of tap into those team members' superpowers and get them to more so focus on the challenges that we're all facing, and then based on their kind of answers to the challenges that we're facing, try to tap into, okay, maybe what are they struggling with, or what are they particularly focused on, right? And try to get some insight into that from maybe where some of their imposter syndrome lies, if it's there. To that second point, one of the primary reasons that I love being a manager and such is because I love building people and my teammates and my team, right? And so I'm always looking for how can I help them grow and get promoted and pass me one day, hopefully, or get transferred to another team, that's even better. And so from that standpoint, I try to tap into what are your kind of goals, right? What are your goals? How do they relate to the team? What maybe are you struggling with? And then sometimes with people that I'm struggling to get to open up, if I can't really get to them to like, hey, let's focus on this from helping the team standpoint, or what in particular are you focused on achieving or something, right? Maybe we're dealing with a problem where we're scared to try to achieve more, to set a high bar, right? Okay, what's the toughest part of what you're doing right now, right? What's the toughest part of the role? And tell me a little bit about that. Okay, that's what we're struggling with. How can we improve on that? So I tend to try and look at goals and strengths and stuff because it allows me to better monitor and kind of mark if how we're seeing improvement, right? So I try to set it up like that and help people achieve their goals, regardless of kind of which generation they're in. But it all comes with a different angle that you have to approach it from. So kind of an answer, non-answer, but I think it depends.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think that is a point, is that it does depend. That, as we go through any of these things, none of what we're saying today is a one size fits all, that you're going to find every answer every time. I think you're making a good point that it depends on the situation. And, to me, your takeaway is you're kind of adjusting to what the situation is with the person that you're dealing with. So I think it's a great point. Mark, what are your thoughts?
I think I just wrapping up a few things that everyone's already mentioned. The first thing, and I mentioned it earlier, problem with experience, we rarely have it until after we first need it. So just make sure everyone feels comfortable that everything's a new adventure nowadays, right? There's nothing cookie cutter. Do we get exhilaration from trying something new and going into uncharted waters? Those are the things that really, can get people motivated and excited, but understand that, hey, we're bound to make some mistakes. We're not going to be that a perfectionist, and there will be some of that self-doubt that comes in. As I work with others, I always want to understand, what are they seeing? What are they experiencing, through their lens? And then from there, let's try and build that recipe. That way, no one feels like, hey, I've got to solve this all on my own. I mentioned earlier when Condoleezza Rice, she shared a story that you can't be an expert in everything. So you have to study and learn. You have to learn how to ask those first and second level questions, right? And sometimes when you learn and you show that transparency or the vulnerability, then all of a sudden you're demonstrating that it's all about the team, it's all about us, and people are bound to then, really gel together. She told one funny story when she was provost at Stanford. She had gotten a request from the physics department for a $17 million telescope. And she certainly did not have expertise. And she said, I certainly was not going to debate the merits with the 3 Nobel Peace physicists who had put the recommendation together. However, what I did do is talk about the financial impact to the university, and ultimately from that perspective. So again, even someone as accomplished, as she is, she knew where her limitations were, and then sought to kind of reframe the question. So again, I think there's a lot of things here that if we can tell that negative committee in the back of our head sometimes, the meeting is over and you're not welcome back, we'll all be a lot better off, but we can't do it just on our own.
Right.
I think, gosh, what's that old cliche, Mark? If the expectation is you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Yeah. Right.
That's great.
I was a master at hiring people much smarter than I. So,
right. Yes. No.
And thank you for that, Mark. I apologize. In all seriousness, before we wrap this up, Rhett, going back to something you said earlier about how you adjust, when we talk about the whole point of this podcast is the whole generational exchange, right? We all are trying to give our perspectives. But I have to say, as Rhett and I have worked in several jobs together, and Jeremy and I have as well, there's not an age thing here. Like, I've felt comfortable with Rhett sharing that I didn't feel comfortable sometimes, or I felt over my skis, right? And Rhett was able to kind of say, hey, from his perspective, this looks pretty good. You're doing okay. So it isn't just always a younger person going to an older person for advice. It can go both ways. And all of you guys have helped me along the way, get out of that mode of feeling like, okay, that last promotion was a fluke. Okay, no, seriously, this last one was a fluke, right? At any minute, they're going to figure out that I do not belong here, right? And you just have to keep looking forward and have great people like you guys around us. All right, so go ahead, Jeremy.
We both got that wonderful former manager that we can probably call him out because we'll talk positively about him. But Mr. Rigoli, right? We got
Jacob. Yeah.
High esteem for this phenomenal manager. And I think when I started working for him, I was early 30s. He was a vice president, also in his early 30s. Right. Probably one of the smartest guys we know. And I got back in touch with him a couple of weeks ago, and he was giving me some feedback on some things I'm working on in the job search. And I just told I was gushing probably and say, oh my gosh, I appreciate it so much. You have no idea how much this means to me. I've kind of had you up on this pedestal since I worked for you. He's like, I don't know who you were remembering, Jeremy, but very, very humble. But I wonder if we were to bring him in as a guest star, if he would probably have a similar take, right? As a vice president of a multinational global corporation with 25,000 employees, if he was feeling the same thing in his early 30s, and for the rest of us around him, we were just wow, this guy's got his act together. So yeah,
Great.
I don't know. It's a fun topic. I like this one. This was a good one today.
I do too. I think it's very very relatable, right? And again, as we've gone through this, we want to separate out having an occasional self-doubt with, really crippling yourself with imposter syndrome, right? That I don't belong. We used to say having a seat at the table, right? That I don't belong at the table. They keep pulling the chair out. I shouldn't sit down because I'm not as smart as the people around me, right? And you really have to get past that. Or it can almost be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm.
I could ask you this question. Speaking of imposter syndrome, does it weigh on you when when folks think that you're Stanley Tucci? Like, does that?
I do get that a lot at airports. I've started thinking, should I monetize this somehow? I gotta figure out a way to do that. But that's definitely more going back to the Suits analogy, right? Where I would definitely be a fraud in that case. I think I could almost pull it off. But
I've been dying for a topic where I could toss that in there. If those of you out there are listening and you haven't brought this up on YouTube, you've gotta check out Mr. Terranova.
I don't see it. I don't see it. It could be worse, I suppose. But
Bring it home, Chris.
all right, let's wrap it up. So let's talk about 5 ways of overcoming imposter syndrome. And this is something that I think we've talked about in general through this whole thing, and we've all used this. But I'm going to run through these really quick, guys. Feel free to jump in, add your thoughts as we go. The first thing is to say that it's normal. It's not unique. You're not the only one who feels that, right? So start by dismantling that feeling of isolation. As we've stated earlier, it's incredibly common. It typically affects high achievers, and it happens across all fields, genders, and races. You talked about Condi Rice. High-profile figures like Michelle Obama or Neil Armstrong have also stated they've experienced similar doubts at various points, and they've had incredible careers, right? We all have, on occasion, had that internal voice that whispers, "You're a fraud," or "This is a fluke," and we've talked about that, right? The second thing to do is to reframe your thinking. Reframe failures as learning opportunities. One of the takeaways that we got from, at least I did, from the education space is that everything can be a learning opportunity. I don't know if you guys remember, but we used to say it isn't win or lose, it's win or learn. Mm-hmm. And that was one of those things. The first time I heard it, I'm like, that is so jive. Like, that is so cliche. But the more I thought about it, I'm like, it really is a nice way to say, you get a kick out of that, Jeremy. It's a nice way to say that everything can be a learning opportunity, right? You can take that time where you didn't do as well as you could have and turn it into a learning opportunity. And, again, Jeremy, we talked about this on the one of the earlier podcasts, I think on the Mentor podcast, where one of the things I used to say about you is you'll make a mistake, but you'll never make the same one twice. Right. And I think that's that reframing a learning opportunity. You would take that opportunity where you didn't do it right, and you would reframe it and do it a different way so you didn't make that same mistake again. Right. And then there are tools like Strength Finders. And Mark, if maybe I could kind of toss it to you about just the idea of Strength Finders. We've all taken it. And, the approach is basically to look at your strengths instead of calling out weaknesses. But maybe you could speak a little more to that.
Yeah, the simplest way is, as you said, it really focuses on what you do best. And when there are times that, you may think, hey, I need to learn more information, I need to think of this a slightly different way, you find a strength buddy, someone that has, different talents than you do, and kind of get some insights from them. And I think the other element too is that it just helps create that better self-awareness. So where Rhett was high in competition, which meant he loved to benchmark against the best, so then he could drive and strive, both himself and his team against that. That was in my lesser theme. So then I would say, okay, Rhett, what are you thinking? How should we look at this opportunity so then we can benchmark? And who are those benchmark people, that we should be looking at? So again, these self-assessment tools, there are a lot of them. They're all helpful because it brings to light, here's where I can really be successful. And then let me figure out what else I need to, fill in some of those gaps.
I think that's right. Thank you. The third thing that I would bring up is to focus on evidence, not emotion. And of course, as an Italian, if you're watching the video, you see my hands moving around all the time. That is not easy for somebody like me, right? But there's ways to overcome that. And one of the things that's suggested is to create a brag book where you actually list your own accomplishments and that positive feedback that you get so that you can celebrate your successes. When you're feeling doubtful or you're unsure, look at the document, right? Even maybe keep your reviews. You'll get positive feedback. Write it down for yourself. That's okay. Don't be afraid to acknowledge your skills and your accomplishments and your experiences. It's okay to say, I did all right there. I did good. Stay focused on those facts and not focused on the emotions. And then we've talked about this. Rhett, you brought this up earlier. Embrace the power of community. Surround yourself with supportive people who believe in you. And, if you want to listen to a great podcast that you haven't listened to yet, go back and listen to our mentor episode, because the whole thing is about surrounding yourself with people who believe in you, right? There is the power in being vulnerable and honest. And Mark, you brought that up earlier as well. It's okay to share your feelings with others. Sometimes just saying it out loud can diminish that feeling of imposter syndrome. You might also get somebody who can commiserate with you or give you a suggestion about how to overcome it. And then finally, take action despite the fear. We talked about this earlier too, getting analysis paralysis, being that expert, having to have everything before you do anything, right? The takeaway here is to do something anyway, even if you feel you're not as capable as you should be, because it's a major victory in overcoming imposter syndrome. I mean, there were times when I applied for a job that I felt like was just a little past my skis, right? But I did it anyway. And just the fact that I did the action gave me some confidence, right? Also, own and celebrate those successes, even if they're small wins. Like we said, it's okay to say that you're doing well, but you got to take the action to do it. And then finally, focus on progress, not perfection, right? Each time you recognize you're starting to spiral downward, and you even try to change, you even recognize that you're failing or you're struggling, you've made progress, and celebrate that in itself. That again will start to build that wall up against imposter syndrome. All right. This was a lot to go over. This was a great episode. There was lots of really good information in here. As always, you guys were super transparent. Any final thoughts before we end the podcast for the day?
Oh, this was great.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, go ahead, Red. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think the biggest, or one of the biggest takeaways here, right? You gave the 5, but don't defeat yourself here. You're not alone in this. You got the promotion or you're in the position because you earned it, or you have at least most, if not all, the skills to do it. There's just always that voice kind of in the back of your head, right? And all of us have it. So don't defeat yourself here. If you're feeling like you're stuck, again, try something new. We have 2 other episodes that you can look into on work-life balance and getting mentors and all these things. It's all built here to help you guys. So, that's what I'd say. Don't defeat yourself here.
All right. That is a great way to end it, guys. Thank you as always. This was a great episode. I think I always learn something when I listen to these shows. For everybody listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Generational Exchange. We hope the conversation between these generations sparked some new ideas and helped you see the business world from fresh perspectives. Don't forget to subscribe for more insightful discussions across the generations. And if you have a burning business question you'd like us to tackle, leave us a comment or shoot us an email at cmsrconsulting@gmail.com. Till next week, from all of us here at the Generational Exchange, thanks for listening and happy learning.